I remember the first time I truly felt the cold breath of fear on my neck. It began with an old book I found in the attic, titled The Vampire, A Tale. Written in 1819 by John William Polidori, it predated the infamous Dracula by nearly 80 years. As I thumbed through its brittle pages, Lord Ruthven, the dangerous and deadly character in Polidori's tale, seemed to leap from the pages, his malevolent presence almost tangible. The story of Lord Ruthven was a precursor to Bram Stoker's Dracula. Ruthven was a man of high society, charming and enigmatic, but with a dark, deadly secret. He preyed on the unsuspecting, drawing them into his web of deceit and ultimately draining their blood. This early depiction of a vampire was chilling, and it laid the groundwork for the archetype we are familiar with today. Yet, Ruthven was not alone. In 1872, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu penned Carmilla, a novella that added a new dimension to the vampire mythos. Carmilla, the titular character, was a beautiful and seductive vampire who preyed on young women. The story explored the erotic and psychological aspects of vampirism, painting it as both a physical and emotional affliction. This tale, with its atmosphere of gothic horror and forbidden desire, captivated readers and set the stage for future vampire literature. And then, of course, there was Bram Stoker's Dracula. Published in 1897, it was the novel that truly cemented the vampire's place in our cultural consciousness. Count Dracula, with his aristocratic demeanor and insatiable thirst for blood, became the definitive vampire. Stoker's novel was a masterful blend of folklore, gothic horror, and modern anxieties, making it both timeless and terrifying. Without Dracula, there would be no Bela Lugosi, no Christopher Lee, and certainly no modern vampire phenomena like Twilight or True Blood. However, what if I told you these tales were not mere fiction? That somewhere, between the lines of Gothic literature and Hollywood's glamorized portrayals, lurked a darker, more sinister truth. The first stirrings of this realization came when I stumbled upon the legend of Lilith, the ancient figure from Babylonian lore. Said to seduce men and steal their blood, Lilith and her counterparts, like the Lilu and Lilitu, were the harbingers of a chilling truth. Vampires, or at least the idea of them, have haunted humanity since the dawn of civilization. Lilith was a night demon, often depicted as a beautiful woman with long, flowing hair and a sinister smile. According to ancient texts, she would visit men in their sleep, seducing them and draining their life force. The people of ancient Babylon feared her, believing that her touch brought sickness and death. The stories of Lilith were not just tales of horror, they were warnings, cautionary tales meant to keep people vigilant against the forces of darkness. In ancient India, there were the Vitala spirits, ghostly beings that inhabited the bodies of the dead and preyed upon the living. These creatures were said to possess immense strength and could control the minds of their victims. The Vitala would drain the blood of their hosts, leaving them weak and lifeless. These spirits were feared and respected, and elaborate rituals were performed to appease them and keep them at bay. Then there was Empusa, from Greek mythology, a creature of nightmares who craved human flesh and blood. Empusa was a shapeshifter, able to transform into a beautiful woman to lure her victims. Once they were in her grasp, she would reveal her true form, a monstrous being with one leg of brass and one leg of a donkey, and feast upon their flesh. The Greeks believed that Empusa was sent by Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, to punish the wicked and devour the innocent. The early Greeks also told tales of Lamia, a vampire-like creature who was the secret lover of Zeus. Driven mad by Hera's jealousy, Lamia became a monster who fed on the blood and flesh of children. Her ghostly form would wander the night, seeking out the young and innocent to satiate her insatiable hunger. The stories of Lamia were meant to instill fear and obedience in children, warning them to stay inside after dark and avoid the dangers that lurked in the shadows. These early tales of bloodthirsty entities hinted at a reality far more unsettling than any novel or film could depict. The idea of creatures that preyed on the living, draining their life force and leaving them empty husks, was a concept that spanned cultures and epochs. The vampire, in its many forms, was a reflection of our deepest fears. The fear of the unknown, the fear of death, and the fear of the dark. My research took me to the dark, dense forests of Scandinavia, where the tales of vampires took on a new, even more terrifying form. Here the legends spoke of the Draugr, monstrous beings of immense strength that terrorized the living. Unlike the vampires of southern Europe, the Draugr were not interested solely in blood. They were also known to hoard treasure and had an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The Draugr were often depicted as ancient warriors, rising from their graves to protect their buried wealth. These creatures were not only powerful but also cunning, capable of shape-shifting and moving through solid objects like ghosts. Their ability to transform into a thick, impenetrable fog made them nearly impossible to kill. How do you plunge a wooden stake into mist? This was a problem that plagued the minds of ancient Scandinavian villagers. The stories of Draugr spoke of their unholy strength and their ghastly deeds. They would break into homes, dragging their victims into the night to feast on their flesh and blood. One tale spoke of a Draugr named Glommer, who terrorized a village until a hero named Grettir confronted him. Even after his death, Glammer's malevolent spirit continued to haunt the area, causing misfortune to all who ventured near. To prevent the dead from rising as Draugr, the ancient Scandinavians took meticulous care in burying their dead horizontally and with proper respect. They believed that if a corpse was interred even slightly angled, it would have a chance of coming back to life. Rituals were performed to ensure that the dead stayed dead, and grave sites were often surrounded by protective charms and symbols. One chilling account described how a village, plagued by the return of a recently deceased warrior, decided to exorcise his spirit. The villagers dug up his grave and found his body perfectly preserved, with a malevolent grin on his face. They drove a stake through his heart, beheaded him, and burned his body to ash. Only then did the village find peace. One of the most chilling accounts in my research was that of Jure Grando, a man from the small village of Kringa in what is now Croatia. Jure Grando lived in the 17th century, and after his death, he returned as a strigoi, instilling terror in the hearts of the villagers. Ali Lovic's tale was one of the most documented cases of vampirism in history. After his death, he was buried in the local cemetery. But unlike other villagers, Jure Grando did not rest in peace. He returned 15 years after his death, causing havoc and fear in Kringa. It started with eerie sightings of a shadowy figure, staring malevolently through the windows of homes, including that of his widow. The village was gripped by terror, and the townsfolk whispered of a demonic presence. The priest of the village, Father Giorgio, was the first to confront the revenant. Armed with a cross, he confronted Jure Grando, who fled with supernatural speed. The villagers knew they had to act decisively to end the nightmare. They gathered one night, under the guidance of Father Giorgio, and exhumed Jure Grando's body. To their horror, they found him in his coffin, looking as though he were merely asleep, with a sinister grin on his face. It was then that Stepan Milasic, a local hero, took a saw and decapitated the vampire. As the blade sliced through, Grando's eyes opened, and he let out a blood-curdling scream, but it was too late. The village had finally rid themselves of the Strigoi's curse. Jure Grando's story was not just a tale of fear, but also one of community and bravery. The villagers' willingness to confront the terror head-on, their unity in the face of the unknown, and their reliance on both religious and traditional methods underscored the depth of human resolve against such horrors. This account blurred the lines between myth and reality, suggesting that perhaps these stories were more than just legend. As my journey into the world of the undead continued, I found myself drawn to two of the most infamous cemeteries known for their vampiric legends: Panteon de Belen Cemetery in Guadalajara, Mexico, and the Highgate Cemetery in London, England. In the late 1800s, Panteon de Belen Cemetery became the stage for a series of terrifying events. The cemetery, with its crumbling gravestones and overgrown paths, was already a place of eerie beauty and sinister reputation. The terror began when the blood-drained body of a woman was discovered on Nardo Street, just outside the cemetery. Her neck bore the unmistakable marks of a vampire's bite. Panic spread quickly through the town, and it wasn't long before more bodies turned up, each with similar wounds. The situation reached a boiling point when the body of a young girl was found in the cemetery itself. She had been recently buried, but someone, or something, had dug her up and drained her blood. The people of Guadalajara were both horrified and enraged. They formed a mob, determined to put an end to the nightmare once and for all. One night, armed with torches, stakes, and crosses, the townsfolk set a trap for the creature. They didn't have to wait long. As the moon reached its zenith, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, prowling among the graves. The mob sprang into action, surrounding the vampire and pinning it to the ground. Despite its supernatural strength and ferocity, the creature could not escape. A wooden stake was driven through its heart, and the vampire's reign of terror ended in a final, blood-curdling scream. To ensure the creature would never rise again, the villagers buried its remains deep in the cemetery and poured concrete over the grave. But legends persist. Some say that a nearby tree, whose roots cracked the concrete slab, bleeds human blood when cut. Whether this is folklore or the remnants of an ancient curse, one thing is certain: Pantheon de Belen remains a place where the line between life and death is perilously thin. The cold winds of fate next blew me to London, where the chilling tale of the Highgate vampire awaited. In the 1960s, the ancient and atmospheric Highgate Cemetery, with its sprawling grounds and Gothic architecture, became the stage for one of the most documented vampire sightings of modern times. Highgate Cemetery had fallen into disrepair. Overgrown and neglected, it was the perfect lair for a creature of the night. Rumors began to circulate of a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes haunting the cemetery. Witnesses reported seeing a gaunt, pale-faced figure, cloaked in black, hovering among the tombstones. The legend grew when a local man, taking a shortcut through the cemetery, encountered the creature. He described a sudden feeling of weakness and disorientation, as if his very life force was being drained. When he looked up, he saw the vampire, its eyes burning like embers, floating several feet off the ground. The man fled, but the encounter left him profoundly shaken. The Highgate vampire quickly became a sensation, drawing the attention of paranormal investigators and curious onlookers alike. One of the most notable figures was David Farrant, who decided to spend a night in the cemetery to see the vampire for himself. Armed with a crucifix and a stake, he ventured into the heart of the cemetery just before midnight. As Farrant wandered through the dark, tangled paths, he felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Suddenly he saw it, a tall figure draped in black, with eyes that seemed to pierce the very soul. Farrant was paralyzed with fear as the creature approached, but just as it seemed all hope was lost, the vampire vanished into thin air, leaving Farrant trembling and gasping for breath. The stories continued to pile up. One woman claimed to have been thrown to the ground by an unseen force while walking past the cemetery at night. Another account told of a creature that dematerialized before the eyes of terrified witnesses. The local newspaper, Hampstead and Highgate Express, ran a headline, "Does a Wampir walk in Highgate?" The article described numerous encounters and speculated on the vampire's origins, suggesting it had been brought to England from Turkey in the 18th century. As the sightings and encounters grew more frequent, two young men, armed with wooden stakes and crucifixes, were arrested while trying to enter the cemetery. Their mission? To destroy the vampire once and for all. Though they were stopped by the authorities, their actions underscored the fear and desperation that had gripped the community. The legend of the Highgate vampire reached its peak in the 1970s, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the sightings ceased. For decades, the vampire seemed to have disappeared into the annals of urban legend until it resurfaced in 2006. A man walking near the cemetery gates reported seeing a dark figure in a long coat and tall hat. The figure greeted him politely, then rose into the air and vanished over the cemetery wall. The Highgate vampire remains one of the most compelling modern vampire legends, a haunting reminder that the shadows of our fears can sometimes take on a life of their own. As I close the final chapter on these eerie accounts, I can't help but feel that same cold breath of fear on my neck that I felt when I first discovered that old book in the attic. From Lord Ruthven to the Draugr of Scandinavia, from the chilling legends of Jure Grando to the haunting shadows of Highgate Cemetery, these stories have revealed a world where the line between myth and reality is perilously thin. So, I leave you with this question. Are you afraid of encountering a vampire? As you ponder these tales, Remember that what seems like mere legend could be lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding. Whether you believe in the undead or not, one thing is certain. These stories have a way of lingering in the shadows of our minds. Next time you find yourself alone in the dark, with the wind whispering through the trees and shadows dancing on the walls, will you dare to dismiss them as mere fiction? Or will you, like me, wonder if somewhere out there, something sinister is watching, waiting? Sweet dreams, if you dare.